The barren station lay smothered in a haze of crimson dust as the train shrieked to its stop. From the platform descended Tina, a tall woman of Apache heritage, her hand gripping a battered old suitcase. Within her chest flickered a fragile spark of hope, that at the end of this long, weary journey she might finally find a home and a husband waiting. But the man who came forward, Caleb Morton, a young trader, greeted her without a trace of warmth. His eyes skimmed her frame, tall, broad across the shoulders, her strong muscles pressing against the plain cloth of her dress. Caleb's lips twisted into a scornful laugh, his voice cutting sharp through the crowd. "I thought I was marrying a lady of refinement. Instead, I find a woman built like a man. Who could ever call that a wife?" His words struck Tina's heart like a blade, shredding her fragile dream. The townsfolk whispered, some chuckled outright. A child jabbed a finger at her and shouted, "The giant woman!" Tina froze, her fingers trembling around the handle of her suitcase. Tears burned behind her eyes, yet she forced her chin upward, though her spirit crumbled inside. Caleb turned away, abandoning her without pause. She sank onto a wooden bench by the platform, surrounded by sneers and cruel stares. The mocking laughter echoed as she curled in on herself, as if cast away by the entire world. Only the desert wind answered, swirling dust around the figure of the abandoned Apache woman clutching her suitcase, her silence heavy with humiliation. The sun slanted low, casting long, stretched shadows across the desolate station, while the jeers of the crowd still lingered in the air. Tina sat motionless, her broad shoulders quivering now and again, the weathered suitcase resting by her feet. In that moment, the world itself seemed to shrink into one forgotten, dusty corner of the wooden platform. Amid the raucous crowd, one man did not laugh. Elias Ward, a rancher hardened by years of labor, stood quietly apart. His leather coat bore the weight of weather and work, his gray eyes cold, his face marked with the lines of a life steeped in struggle. Elias had buried his wife long ago, and since then he had lived alone on a stretch of desolate land to the west of town. He was not a man who involved himself in the troubles of others, but something in the sight before him, the proud Apache woman left in shame, her dark eyes trying in vain to hide her pain, stirred him enough to keep his boots rooted to the ground. Instead of turning away, he stepped forward. The crowd stilled instantly. Every face recognized the quiet rancher, the man who rarely spoke, whose solitude was guarded as fiercely as the revolver always at his hip. He halted in front of Tina, and she raised her head. Her eyes, wet with unshed tears, burned with suspicion, sharp as a cornered wolf ready to strike. Elias did not offer soft words, nor did he pry with questions. His voice, low and roughened by years of wind and dust, broke the silence with only 3 words. "Come with me." Tina's body stiffened. Doubt crashed through her thoughts like a storm. Was he another man looking to take advantage of her? Was this some cruel trick dressed in kindness? But when she held his gaze, all she saw there was stillness, hard and unmoving as stone. No ridicule, no pity. Without hesitation, Elias bent, lifted her heavy suitcase with one hand, and turned away. His steps were steady, deliberate. For several seconds she sat frozen, but at last she rose and followed. There was nowhere else for her to go. The road out of town stretched into dust, wind whipping sand into their faces. Elias rode astride his horse while Tina walked alongside, barefoot. The sharp stones cut into her feet, leaving smears of blood with each step, yet her spine remained straight. Neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the creak of leather from the saddle and the heavy rhythm of her footsteps. A woman too large for the world around her, eyes blazing with a wordless longing to belong somewhere. By nightfall, the outline of a small ranch appeared on the open prairie. A modest wooden cabin stood there, its fence leaning, its barn silent under the starry dark. Elias dismounted, opened the door, and with a brief nod said, "There's room here. If you wish to leave, go at first light. If you stay, then live as a human being." Tina paused on the threshold, caught in the clash between doubt and hope. Then, with a breath that felt like surrender and defiance at once, she stepped inside. For the first time in years, she entered a room with a roof that could shelter her from the night. Something within her shifted. Her path had turned. The following morning, she awoke to the calls of roosters mingled with the restless howl of the prairie wind. Pale dawn light slipped through cracks in the door, falling across the scars carved along her strong arms. She had slept on a hard wooden bed beneath a patchwork quilt, thin but clean, carrying the faint warmth of sun-dried cloth. For the first time in as long as she could recall, her dreams had not been plagued by fear or cold. In the kitchen, Elias had been awake long before her. He tended the fire, smoke curling through the narrow window frame. Without a greeting, he slid a simple bowl of bean soup across the rough table and returned to slicing strips of cured meat. Tina lowered herself to the bench, eating in silence, her dark eyes flicking to him now and again. He was weathered, wordless, yet in the rhythm of his movements she found something striking, an absence of scorn. The day stretched onward, slow and quiet. Elias led his horse toward the open field, the reins loose in his hand. Behind him, Tina, without being told, took up a broom. She swept the floor, pushed the chairs into order, and tugged at the torn curtain by the window, stitching it with awkward, untrained fingers. Her hands were rough and unskilled, yet every motion carried determination, an unspoken plea to prove her worth, to show she was not a burden. By afternoon, Elias returned carrying a load of firewood across his shoulders. When Tina stepped outside to meet him, her bare feet pressing into the cracked, sun-baked earth, he moved to wave her off. But then he caught the look in her eyes, unyielding, fierce with quiet resolve. He said nothing. Instead, he lowered the bundle, and together they carried the wood inside. No words passed between them, only the sound of shared breath blending with the steady whistle of the wind rolling across the grasslands. When night fell, they sat across from one another at the dinner table. An oil lamp glowed between them, its golden light softening the hard creases of Elias's weather-worn face and casting shadows across Tina's high cheekbones. The silence stretched long, pressing down heavy on the room. At last Tina broke it. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Was it pity?" Elias looked up slowly. The steel gray of his eyes caught the lamplight. His tone was calm even. "No, I just couldn't stand to see them treat you that way." His words stunned her. After years of being mocked, dismissed, and treated as something less than human, no one had ever spoken to her with such simple truth. That night, as she lay down on the hard bed beneath the patchwork blanket, a fragile ember of hope stirred inside her. She thought of a dream she had long buried, a home to belong to, a man strong enough to stand beside her, perhaps even a child, one who might someday call her mother. Things once impossibly distant now flickered faintly within these wooden walls. The prairie wind screamed against the cabin all through the night, but in Tina's heart, for the first time, there was a tender sliver of peace. Yet peace in Dry Hollow was never left unchallenged. Whispers spread quickly. The towering Apache woman was living under Elias Ward's roof. Some laughed outright. Others muttered that the reclusive rancher had gone mad. In the dim back corner of the saloon, Emery Granger, who had once written for her hand, sat grinding his teeth. Humiliated before the entire town, he could not bear the thought of Tina, his bride on paper, finding refuge in another man's house. A week later, he returned to the station, not alone. At his side was Jeb Mullen, a scarred brute whose fists were like hammers and whose reputation was painted in blood. Jeb's name was whispered in fear wherever he went. Violence followed him like a shadow. Emery, too much a coward to face Elias himself, sought strength in hired brutality. That afternoon, Elias and Tina rode into town to buy salt, nails, and a handful of seed packets. But as they stepped onto Main Street, the air itself seemed to tighten like a bowstring pulled to its limit. Conversations broke off mid-word. Heads turned. Fingers pointed. Tina walked tall at Elias's side, her frame rising above most in the crowd. A figure both impossible to ignore and impossible to forget. Tina's dark eyes held steady, but her fingers betrayed her, gripping the hem of her dress a little too tightly. Then, without warning, Jeb planted himself squarely in their path. His voice scraped like gravel. "This woman belongs to my boss. Hand her over and walk away." Elias halted. Slowly, he lowered the sack of seed packets to the dusty ground. His gray gaze swept over Jeb, then shifted to Emery, skulking just behind his hired brute. When Elias spoke, his words were level, yet they cut clean through the hushed street. "She belongs to no man. She walks with me because she chooses to." The entire crowd held its breath. For an instant, silence locked the world in place. Then Jeb's lip curled and his massive hand hovered above the pistol hanging heavy at his side. Tina stood behind Elias, her heart hammering, but for the first time in her life, something sparked inside her chest. A man was standing before her, not to shame her but to defend her. The air grew taut, thick with the threat of gunpowder. A twitch, a breath, a wrong glance could unleash violence. Elias edged forward half a step, his right hand hovering close to the Colt at his hip. In the fierce red light of the sinking sun, his lean form looked forged from iron, the prairie itself holding still with him. At last, it was Emery who faltered. Fear won over bravado. He caught Jeb's arm and muttered, "Not here. Not now." Together they backed away. Yet Emery's eyes burned with bitter hatred, promising this was far from finished. As Elias and Tina walked out of town, whispers rippled behind them. Some nodded in quiet respect, others shook their heads in contempt. But inside Tina's chest, only one thought repeated, "He stood for me." Before them all, that night by the firelight, Tina finally spoke freely. Her voice was steady and deep, carrying weight like the steady beat of a drum. "If you'll have me, I'll stay. I'm not leaving. Thank you for standing here." The ranch, after that tense day in Dry Hollow, grew into a rare refuge. Tina tied back her thick hair and set herself to work, her strong hands learning to mend fences, to chop wood, even to drive cattle across the pasture. Elias, a man who had always kept words locked away, found himself watching her each morning as she strode beside him. The hollowness that had gnawed at him for years began little by little to lift. One evening, Elias noticed her arm still swollen from an old fall. Quietly, without fuss, he soaked herbs and pressed them gently against the bruise. Tina winced, but she did not push him away. Instead, she met his gaze. Her eyes, once guarded, now held something softer: gratitude. That night, with firelight dancing across the room, she spoke in her slow, broken English. "In my tribe, I was the one they mocked, the one they left behind. But here," she placed her hand on her chest, "I feel warmth." Elias did not answer with words. He simply set another log on the fire, letting the glow wash across his weather-beaten face. Then, in his quiet way, he gave her a single, steady nod. For Elias, the meaning of home had died the day fever carried off his wife and child. He had made a life of solitude in that house ever since, a place of rooms and silence. Yet now, with Tina by his side, the thought of living alone beneath that roof felt suddenly less certain. He found to his surprise that he did not want the empty house to hold him any longer. Meanwhile, in Dry Hollow's saloon, Emery Granger drowned his humiliation in whiskey. The memory of that afternoon still felt like a blade at his ribs. Slurring and seething, he paced the bar and inveighed to Jeb Mullen, each word soaked in spite. "He stole her from me right out in front of everyone. If I don't take her back, what kind of man am I?" Jeb grinned with a mouth full of broken teeth and spat the answer. "Then we take him out. One old rancher and one oversized woman. Me and a couple of the boys can handle that." The plan was born over spilled drink and clinking glasses. One night, while Elias checked the range, Jeb and his hired men would set an ambush, overpower the ranch, and force Tina back as Emery's claimed possession. Unaware of the plot gathering like a storm on the horizon, Elias and Tina spent their days repairing a new roof on the grain shed. When Elias handed her a hammer, Tina laughed. A small, soft sound so unfamiliar that it surprised them both. Laughter had not often been part of a life shaped by scorn. Evenings found Elias on the porch with his pipe, Tina close by, sharpening a blade. Her tall silhouette was a steady presence beneath the lamplight. In that quiet, something slow and warm began to grow, a fragile trust, a steadying ember between them. But down in the valley, Jeb's wagon wheels turned, hauling whiskey, gunpowder, and malice. Night no longer meant simply rest. It hinted at violence drawing near. A crescent moon hung over the prairie, silvering the fence posts and the low grass. Wind threaded through the corral like a whisper. Elias stood on the porch, his Winchester propped against the doorframe. The old dog's low growl rose, its hackles stiff. He felt, with the hard certainty of a man who had lived long with danger, that something was coming. Inside, Tina fed another log into the stove. Flames licked the wood and smoke curled toward the ceiling, casting light across her bare, powerful shoulders. Her hand paused mid-sharpen, then stilled. She had heard the dog. Her warrior instincts snapped alert. Those instincts never truly left her. Then the heavy thud of hooves struck the ground beyond the fence. One, then many, pounding the dry earth in a living drumbeat. Elias tightened his fingers around the rifle and said, "No one cold. They're here." Before he could finish, The window burst inward with a crash. A bullet punched through the ceiling beam. Tina sprang, grabbed the compact carbine Elias kept near the stove, and peered into the night as shadows moved across the yard. Jeb Mullen and 3 others loomed there, weapons flashing in the moonlight. Jeb bellowed like a cornered beast, "Hand the woman over or both of you die tonight." Elias answered with a single thunderous shot that kicked up dirt at Jeb's feet. The air erupted in gunfire. Glass shattered. Flames reflected in flying shards. Tina did not flinch. She dropped to one knee, pressed the carbine stock to her shoulder, and fired twice. One of Jeb's men screamed and pitched from his saddle, falling with a thud that sounded like the end of a threat. Elias moved with cold precision, covering Tina's flank like a man forged in older wars. His rifle cracked with the steady rhythm of experience. Jeb let out a guttural roar and charged, an axe gripped tight in his scarred fists. Tina hurled her knife with a fierce snap of her wrist. The blade struck deep into the fence post inches from his face, forcing him to stumble back before bellowing again. He brought the axe down on the fence in a furious swing, sparks flashing against the firelit night. Elias yanked Tina back inside, shoving the heavy table against the door. His voice, firm as stone, rumbled, "They won't cross this threshold." Tina met his eyes, fierce, determined, and warm all at once. For the first time in her life, she was not facing the fight alone. Outside, Jeb and his men howled like jackals, hurling torches onto the roof. Flames clawed upward, spreading across the thatch until the night sky glowed crimson with fire. Their sneering faces twisted in the light of destruction. Yet within that small house, a weather-beaten rancher and a cast-off warrior stood shoulder to shoulder, weapons clenched, hearts beating in unison. The wind carried smoke across the prairie. Gunfire cracked and echoed against the hills. Above it all rose a defiant will to survive, and something more, a bond born in blood and fire, that neither had expected to find. The roof roared with flame, collapsing as ashes spiraled into the star-choked sky. From the barn came the panicked bawl of cattle, thrashing in terror at the gunfire and heat. Elias crouched in the corner, reloading his Winchester, his sharp eyes fixed on the gap in the door. Beyond the fence, Jeb and his gang circled wide, intent on breaking into the barn and burning everything to the ground. "They mean to torch the whole place," Elias muttered, voice gravelly. Sweat and soot streaked Tina's bronze-toned face. One leg still ached from an old wound, but her black eyes burned as bright as live embers. She tightened her grip on the carbine, then laid it aside. With her other hand, she drew the long Apache blade she carried at her hip. "I'll stop him," she said. Elias shook his head, but before he could stop her, Tina burst through the side door like a gust of desert wind. The door slammed back against the wall as her towering form filled the firelight, halting the men in their tracks. Jeb snarled, dropping his axe to draw a pistol, but Tina was already on him. One hand clamped his wrist like iron, knocking the barrel aside. Her knife slashed close to his throat, gleaming with deadly promise. He shoved back and the two collided, grappling in the dirt with brutal force. The other outlaws raised their rifles, but Elias's Winchester thundered from the window. One man fell instantly, dead before he hit the ground. The others dove behind the wagon, too shaken to rush forward across the firelit yard. Tina and Jeb rolled in the dirt like beasts locked in primal combat. His size and fury made him dangerous, but her strength was greater. Her arms coiled around his neck in a crushing hold even as he hacked downward with his axe. A sharp gash cut across her shoulder, blood running hot, but she roared. A sound that carried the promise of defiance, the cry of one who would never yield. With a violent bellow, Jeb heaved her off, flinging her with all his strength. They tumbled down the slope beyond the fence, dirt and sparks flying, their bodies lit by the raging fire that painted the prairie red. Jeb's filthy hand tangled in her hair, yanking hard as he tried to pin her to the dirt. But Tina fought back with the strength of someone who had endured too much to ever yield. Her hand found the haft of his axe. In the next breath, the blade bit across his arm, blood sprayed in a crimson arc, splattering the ground. Jeb howled, staggering backward. Tina rose to her full height, her body gleaming in the firelight like a bronze statue, her black eyes burning with feral rage. With a cry that rang across the valley, she drove him to the ground, her knife pressed firm against his throat. "You will never touch me again," she growled through clenched teeth. Jeb gasped for air, blood soaking the earth beneath him. When Elias arrived, Winchester still warm from the last shot, he found Tina standing tall, unflinching amid fire and ash, her knife trembling only slightly in her grip. Her gaze, though, never wavered. Elias placed a steady hand on her shoulder. His voice was low, solid as bedrock. Enough. We're alive tonight. That's victory. Ash drifted upward into the black sky like the curtain closing on a battle written in smoke and flame. In the days that followed, silence returned to Dry Hollow Valley. Emery Granger disappeared, too humiliated ever to show his face again. Jeb, bloodied and broken, slunk away as well, leaving behind only ashes, spent cartridges, and the memory of a night when the prairie itself had burned. Though scarred by bullet holes and roofless from fire, the ranch still stood, and within its wounded timbers, something new was taking root. Tina cleared the ruins with her powerful arms, lifting beams Elias could not move alone. Elias chopped the wood. Tina raised the fence. Their rhythm was quiet but sure. Two people working in sync, no need for many words. Only glances and steady hands that fit together like clockwork. That evening, as the cattle wandered back from the pasture, Tina sat on the porch. On her sun-darkened face, the old scars softened, and in her black eyes shone a peaceful light she had never known before. She placed a broad hand against her belly and whispered, "I never thought I'd live to call any place home." Elias stood beside her, silent for a long while, then wrapped his arm around her shoulders. It was not a passing gesture. It was a choice, a vow. In the red wash of sunset, they were no longer the lonely rancher and the cast-off warrior. They were two broken souls who had found each other and chosen to mend together. The townsfolk kept talking, kept whispering cruel names. But Elias paid no mind. He walked beside her in the marketplace, her hand in his, never wavering. His presence silenced laughter, and over time the whispers shifted. People no longer saw a woman too large. They saw a wife of strength walking proudly at her husband's side. 1 month later, the doctor rode in from Prescott to check on Tina's old wounds. He smiled as he delivered the news. She was with child. In that humble house, the words ignited a flame of joy. Elias sat on the steps for a long time, pipe smoke curling in the air as he gazed at the fields. The ache of losing his first family slowly loosened, replaced by the vision of a new child, yet to be born. On the final night of summer, beneath the wooden porch, Tina laid her head against Elias's shoulder. Together they sat beneath the starlit sky in silence. Out there in the prairie, they were no longer survivors clinging to scraps of life. They were a family. And, my friends, in this harsh land of the West, none of us chooses where we are born. But we do choose who we stand beside and what kind of home we build. Even a cabin scarred by fire becomes stronger than a fortress when held together by love and trust. That more than gold or land is the greatest treasure a soul can claim. Thank you for listening to this tale. Wherever your own trails may lead, may peace and joy follow close behind.